Hi, I'm Paul Nation. Of all the books I've written for language teachers, the one that I like the most is a book called What Should Every EFL Teacher Know? Be careful about the EFL because I've also written a book called What Should Every ESL Teacher Know? Most of the things that we are talking about on this video are also covered in that book. You can get the book on Amazon.com and it's published by Compass Publishing in Korea. I'm happy with that book because I wrote it so that people who are just early into teaching or who haven't had any training in teaching English as a foreign language could get some idea of what I consider to be the most important things that they should know. In this video, I'm going to talk about pair conversation, and that is where learners talk to each other. In a previous video, we looked at learning the survival vocabulary. The survival vocabulary is a list of 120 words and phrases that are really useful if you go to stay in another country for a short time. This survival vocabulary involves pair conversation because the person in the foreign country talks to some native speaker in that country, either to be polite to them or to get directions or to buy things or to order food or to find accommodation or to travel. And so pair conversation should really begin with learners getting on top of the survival vocabulary. You can find the survival vocabulary on my website, and you can find it under Publications 1991 on my website as well. There are many topics that are useful to cover in pair conversation, and a teacher needs to consider the topics so that learners are really talking about things which are relevant and useful for them. Here are some of the topics that could be dealt with in pair conversation. Talking about yourself and what you do. If you're a student, then being a student is what you do. Talking about your family. Talking about what you've done recently. Talking about a movie. Talking about your recent travels. Talking about your hometown. Asking for directions. Asking about public transport. Using the post office. It's quite easy to come up with a list of useful topics, and you can find a list in the book I've just mentioned, What Should Every EFL Teacher Know? But teachers should look at that list and adapt it to the needs of their learners. It's probably quite useful to do a ranking activity on the topics to decide which ones are really important for your learners to be able to deal with in their speaking. If your learners are rather low proficiency learners, it may be necessary to develop model conversations that they can memorize when they begin to do speaking on that particular topic. When learners start speaking, it's very useful to teach them a speaking strategy. This strategy is called question followed by short answer plus extra information, or Q, essay plus EI. This strategy is really important if people have to sit interviews, but it's also important in ordinary conversation. It works like this. If someone asks you a question, you should give a short answer to that question, but you should also provide some extra information. Here's an example. If someone asks, "Where do you come from?" That's the question. You can give a short answer, China, and then you should give some extra information. And that extra information might be, I come from Yunnan province. Or, I've only been in New Zealand for 2 weeks. And so you give some extra piece of information as a part of your answer. There's a reason for this. If you only give a short answer to the question, the message to the listener will be, you don't really want to continue the conversation. So, for example, if someone says, "Where are you from?" and you say, "China." "How long have you been here?" 2 weeks. And at that point, they'll probably give up talking to you because the questioner's having to do all the work. When you provide some extra information, this signals that you are interested in continuing the conversation. But what the extra information also does is it gives the person who asked you the question something else to ask about or to talk about. So if, for example, you say, "I'm from China, I've only been here a couple of weeks," then that person can then say, "Oh, have you had any difficulties during that time? Or have you been in Wellington all of that time?" They have something that they can then take up to continue the conversation. Here are some examples of that formula being used. "How are you, Albert?" That's the question. "I'm good." That's the short answer. "And you, how's your family?" That's the extra information that you provide with the short answer. So you're now giving the questioner a chance to talk about their family. The good thing about that is, if you add a question as the extra information, this means that you can have a bit of a rest from talking and get some listening practice. Here's another example. "Are you okay?" That's a question. "I'm fine." That's the short answer. "I was just feeling a bit dizzy, but I'm okay now." And so that information, "I was feeling a bit dizzy," will then probably get the person who asked the question to talk some more about how you were feeling. Here's another example. "Aren't you doing Linguistics 201? That's the question. "Yes, I'm really enjoying it." So really enjoying it is giving a feeling about the subject that you just asked about. So you might notice that the extra information can be an additional fact, or it can be a feeling that you have about that particular aspect of the topic, or it can be another question that then turns the question towards the person who asked you the first question. It's useful in class to get learners to practice this strategy of question followed by short answer followed by extra information. And the practice should really come in providing different kinds of extra information. This strategy is really important if people are preparing to speak in interviews, such as job interviews or interviews for a scholarship or something like that. Because when you get very good at providing extra information, you can then steer the topic of the conversation in the direction where you want to steer it. So providing extra information allows the person to take control of the topic of the conversation. So, for example, if you really are quite familiar with talking about your family or talking about your home situation, you can make sure that the extra information that you provide deals with your family or deals with your home situation. So if someone asks, "Have you been here very long?" you might then answer, 2 weeks, and I'm really missing my family. So now the topic of conversation is going to move to your family, and so you're on very familiar ground. Teachers should teach this strategy to the learners. This is a part of language-focused learning, But once it becomes language-focused learning and a bit of practice, it can then become a part of meaning-focused output and meaning-focused input. But it's a very useful strategy because it provides ways of gaining more input and it provides ways of controlling the conversation. Speaking activities need to be repeated. Activities like practicing question followed by short answer followed by extra information shouldn't just consist of one lesson or part of a lesson. A strategy like this should be revisited at least 5 or 6 times over several weeks or months. In any lesson, the old material in a lesson is much more important than the new material. That is, practice and repetition is much more important than presentation. Teachers often get concerned about the initial presentation of material. They shouldn't be very concerned about this. The presentation of new material is something that occurs only once for particular material, and it's never enough for the material to be learnt. The really important material in any lesson is the old material, because that material is getting near to being learnt. So that means that if you practice learners speaking on topics, working in pairs, using strategies and so on, it's important to keep coming back to these things again and again over spaced intervals, because you want to reach the point where the learners are very familiar with that particular topic area, with that particular type of language, so that they can use it quite fluently. Fluency develops through repetition and practice. And so, in any lesson, the old material should be the material that the teacher is giving most attention to. It's useful for learners to do language-focused learning about conversation. The way that we use language when we speak is very much affected by the culture and by the language collocations and norms that we use in that particular language. For example, when you talk on the telephone, how do you signal that you're reaching the end of what you want to talk about and that it's time to hang up the telephone? What do you say when you want to send that signal? Well, teachers should give attention to native speaker conversations in a written form so that learners can learn some of these important conversational strategies and features. Here is a list of things that teachers could focus on when giving this particular attention. The first thing to notice in any conversation is who talks to who, because you want to see, are the people well known to each other? Are they not well known to each other? What kind of relationship exists between them? And how is this likely to affect what they talk about? A second thing to notice is who starts the small talk. Small talk is talk about things which are just not really important in terms of information, but which develop friendly relationships between people. These are things like, how are you? How's your family? What did you do last night? All sorts of things like that. This is not really the goal of conversation, but it's a very important part of conversation because it builds a friendly relationship between the speakers. Another thing to look at is what people talk about in conversation, what kinds of extra information they provide, what kinds of topics are covered in the small talk. Another thing to look at is the kind of feedback that people provide to each other. So if you're listening and someone's talking, what are you actually saying to acknowledge that you're listening? When is it most appropriate to provide minimal feedback so that when learners talk to each other, when is it enough to say, yeah, like that, rather than having to give a more complete sentence? So there are lots of things that you can focus on when you give some deliberate attention to conversation. Let's look at an example of a conversation and note some of these points. So here's a conversation between two people who work at the same place. The conversation begins with a greeting, which is a very short greeting, simply morning, which actually means good morning. And then the other person replies, morning, John, and he just acknowledges the other person by giving their name. The small talk begins, how are you? Okay, and that's a very common kind of small talk in English, simply asking people how they feel. In general, people don't give an honest answer to this. They simply respond, oh, okay, or not so bad, or something like that. In this particular example, the person says, not so bad. If you started to give a big list of all your illnesses, then you might be discouraging the continuing of the conversation. It's quite a way through the conversation, almost at the end, that we get the real reason for the conversation. You can see the sentence, haven't spotted a little steam cleaner like, have you? And that's the reason actually for having the conversation, because John in the conversation is looking for something, but before simply asking, have you seen the steam cleaner? They actually want to have small talk so that they can develop their friendly relationship to this person before they then finally ask the question that they want to really find out about. Unfortunately, the other person hasn't seen it and just gives a short answer, no. Notice that there's no extra information on that question, and this probably signals that the conversation is coming to an end. It's quite useful then to do some language-focused learning, looking at conversations, so that learners get some understanding of how the conversation carries on and the kinds of things you're expected to do in a conversation. It's also useful to contrast the kind of small talk that people do in English with the kind of small talk which is done in the first language. Often the things which are talked about in small talk are not the same. In some languages, people talk about eating quite a lot and inquire whether someone's eaten a meal and what they had and so on like that. That's not so common in English. We are more likely to talk about the weather or our health. So we have looked briefly at looking at language-focused learning and conversation and giving particular attention to some strategies and also to analysing conversations. How much pair conversation should there be in a language course? It's possible to answer that question by looking at the 4 strands. We have to decide where pair conversation fits into the 4 strands. And clearly it would fit into the meaning-focused input strand because pair conversation involves listening as well as speaking. It also clearly fits into the meaning-focused output strand because pair conversation involves speaking. It also fits into the fluency development strand because when we want learners to become fluent at speaking, we also want them to become fluent at speaking with another person. So we then have to look at each of those strands and say, well, how much of the meaning-focused input strand should involve pair conversation, and how much of the meaning-focused output strand should involve pair conversation? What other kinds of speaking activities would we need to fit into that strand? And in the meaning-focused output strand, for example, pair conversation has to spend or share time with monologue, where people give long, extended talks. And so it's likely that about half of the speaking activity in the meaning-focused output strand should be pair conversation, and maybe about half or a little less could be monologue. The same could be true of the listening part of the meaning-focused input strand. If we look at the fluency strand, we could get the same kind of balance as well. About half of the speaking activity to develop listening fluency should involve some kind of pair interaction, and maybe about half of the speaking fluency practice should involve speaking monologue. So if you want to look at any particular language learning activity and make some kind of rational decision about how much time you should spend on that activity, you should first think, what strand does this activity fit into? What other activities have to share time in that strand with this activity? And then you try and see what's a good balance between those two kinds of activities. Is one more important than the other and should get more time? Or are they equally important and should get about the same time? And you need to think about that and then balance the time between them. Sometimes an activity might fit into a strand but is not as important as all the other activities in that strand. That might mean that that activity is probably not worth including in the language course because there are better things that can be done in the same time. So any time that you want to consider how much effort and time you should spend on a particular activity, consider what strand or strands it fits into, what else it has to compete with for time in that strand, and therefore how much time you should spend on it.